The 4-line trembled in Katie Rodriguez's hands as she adjusted the drip rate, her fingers moving with the kind of precision that came from somewhere deeper than nursing school. Muscle memory. 100 battlefield triage sites. The kind of memory the military had ordered her to forget. She steadied her breath, watching the saline flow into Colonel James Hartman's forearm with the focused calm of someone who had done this while mortars shook the ground beneath her boots. Dr. Sterling stood 3 feet away, watching her work. His white coat hung perfectly pressed, his name embroidered in navy thread above a logo that read Cardiac Unit Director. He was the kind of man who wore authority the way other men wore cologne, not because it improved anything, but because he needed everyone to smell it. His eyes moved across Katie's trembling hands with the detached curiosity of someone examining a laboratory specimen. He saw a new probationary nurse. A woman trying too hard. A pair of hands that didn't quite belong in his unit yet. He didn't see Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez. He didn't see the hands that had held a tourniquet on a Marine's thigh while IED shrapnel still sang through the air above them. He didn't see the woman who could locate ephemeral pulse in complete darkness, in screaming chaos, in the kind of blood loss that made most people freeze solid. He didn't see the person who had spent 14 years moving through war zones with the kind of controlled precision that saved lives or ended them, depending on which side of a rifle you happened to be standing. Katie finished adjusting the 4 and stepped back, her left leg bearing slightly less weight than her right, a habit, not a limp, though it had been both once. The scar tissue under her scrubs ran from hip to knee, a roadmap of an explosion that had killed 2 people standing beside her. The military called that survival. They called her a liability. They ordered her to disappear. That was 3 years ago. Now she worked the cardiac unit at Oak Creek Memorial in Savannah, keeping her head down, speaking only when necessary, doing the job with a precision that made everyone uncomfortable because they couldn't explain where it came from. Most nurses needed to think their way through procedures. Katie's hand simply knew. This made supervisors nervous. It made doctors suspicious. It made Dr. Sterling's eyes narrow in a way that suggested he was mentally cataloging inconsistencies. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song overhead, a sound that never stopped, never changed, never let you forget you were in a place where people came to heal or to die. Katie had learned to move through that hum the way a fish moves through water, so completely adapted to it that silence would feel wrong now. The antiseptic smell of the cardiac unit, a sharp chemical blend of bleach and hand sanitizer, had soaked into her scrubs so thoroughly that it came home with her, lingered in her apartment, marked her as hospital property even in her off hours. It was 7:02 a.m. when Sterling made his rounds, the morning shift change still rippling through the unit like a tide. Nurses in blue scrubs passed nurses in white. Orders were repeated. Monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Katie moved between rooms with the kind of efficiency that drew no attention, which was exactly the point. Invisibility was a survival skill. The military had taught her that. The military had taught her that the best soldiers were the ones nobody noticed. In the changing room, Katie opened her locker, number 34, bottom shelf, in the back corner, and the worn combat boots fell slightly as she reached for a fresh set of scrubs. The plastic bag they were wrapped in made a dry whisper as it shifted. The boots themselves were desert tan, the leather cracked and faded, the soles worn paper-thin by 1,000 kilometers of patrol routes through Fallujah and Ramadi and Sanjin Valley. They had belonged to her once. They belonged to a woman who didn't exist anymore. She kept them anyway, because burning evidence was a federal crime, and because sometimes you needed proof that you had actually lived through what you had lived through. Dr. Sterling was walking past the changing room, not walking, gliding, the way men with power glide through spaces that belong to everyone but feel like they own them personally. He paused. His eyes caught the open locker, the plastic-wrapped boots, the way Katie's fingers were gentle with them, the way her jaw tightened as she closed the locker door a fraction too quickly. He didn't say anything. He noted it. That was worse. Katie turned, aware of his gaze the way a deer is aware of a rifle scope, a prickling awareness that comes from survival instinct, not conscious thought. She met his eyes. Held them for exactly 2 seconds. Then looked away. This was the balance she had learned to walk: enough presence to do the job, enough deference to avoid questions. Enough visibility to be trusted, enough invisibility to be forgotten. "Morning, doctor," she said. 10 words or less. The nurse's version of a salute. "Rodriguez," he replied, his voice pitched at the frequency of someone making a mental note. "How are you settling in?" "You're what, 3 weeks into probation?" 3 months, Katie corrected quietly. "Almost done." Sterling smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't warm his face, just stretched it. "Let's make sure you stay on track. I like to know my people. Their backgrounds. Their experience. Where they come from." His eyes flicked back toward her locker. "Unusual to have gaps in a resume, wouldn't you say?" Katie's hands were steady. Her voice was steady. This was a test. Not a question. A test. And the answer he wanted was not the answer he would get, because the truth was classified and she had signed documents promising to lie about it for the rest of her life. "Military background," she said, which was true, and took time away for personal reasons, which was a lie that covered the erasure, the orders, the whole apparatus of a life being surgically removed from official records. "I'm here to work, doctor. That's all." Sterling's eyes lingered on her for 3 more seconds. Then he nodded, turned, and walked toward the ward, his presence leaving a kind of pressure change in the air, the way the atmosphere shifts right before a storm rolls in. What he didn't know was that Katie had just made a calculation. He was the type who would dig. The type who measured worth through institutional hierarchy and board connections. The type who saw inconsistencies as threats because he had built a career on control, and control required everyone to fit neatly into boxes he had constructed. She had maybe 2 weeks before he decided to pull her file, make some calls, find out that her references didn't check out because her references were classified, that her employment history didn't make sense because entire chapters had been redacted by people who answered to people who answered to the Pentagon. The shift stretched on. Katie moved through the ward with practiced silence, checking monitors, adjusting oxygen, charting vitals in a shorthand that was half medicine and half muscle memory. Most of the patients barely noticed her. To them, she was the efficient one, the competent one, the nurse who didn't chat or explain or make you feel like you were taking up space. This was what she wanted. This was the goal. Then Colonel James Hartman's room needed her attention. He was in bed for Air Force insignia on the visitor chair, a photograph of 2 young people, grandchildren, maybe, taped to the monitor. He had the kind of face that suggested a man used to giving orders, used to being obeyed, used to the kind of respect that comes with rank and the weight of command. His left forearm was marked with a tattoo, letters in clean military block, Katie. Katie paused at the door. Only for a moment. 1 breath. 2. Then she moved into the room with professional efficiency, checking the 4-line, noting his oxygen saturation on the monitor, 97%, good, stable, adjusting his pillows with the kind of gentle competence that suggested she had done this 10,000 times. The colonel watched her work. His eyes followed her hands. There was something in his face, a flicker of something, like he was trying to play someone he had seen in a dream a long time ago. "You okay there, Colonel?" Katie kept her voice neutral, professional, the voice of Oak Creek Memorial Cardiac Unit, not the voice of a woman who had carried this man through enemy fire while his blood soaked through her uniform and her hands moved on their own because thinking would have gotten them both killed. "Fine," he said. "Fine. You remind me of someone." "Probably just one of those faces," Katie replied, and she didn't smile, didn't explain, didn't acknowledge the tattoo that carried her name like a secret that had never been actually secret at all. She finished adjusting his care and stepped back. "Press the call button if you need anything." "What's your name?" the colonel asked. "Katie Rodriguez," she said. "RN." He stared at her. For a long moment, stared. The recognition hung between them like a ghost. Then his eyes clouded, and the moment passed, and he nodded slowly and turned back to the window where Savannah spread out below them, a city he didn't recognize, in a life that had somehow become completely different from the one he had lived in Baghdad. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Sterling had watched the entire exchange from the nursing station. Watched Katie's movements. Watched the Colonel's reaction. Watched the way she handled the situation with a composure that suggested she had been trained to handle exactly this kind of moment. His eyes were the color of cold steel, and his smile was gone now, replaced by something harder. Something calculating. The look of a man who had just found his first inconsistency, his first proof that something about Katie Rodriguez didn't quite fit. He was already reaching for his phone. Already making a mental note of her references. Already beginning the process of understanding who she actually was, or at least who she was pretending not to be. Katie didn't know this yet. She was in the break room, drinking terrible coffee that had been brewed 6 hours earlier, staring out the window at the parking lot below and the rain that had just started falling like a judge rendering a verdict. She was thinking about the combat boots in her locker. She was thinking about the name on Colonel Hartman's arm. She was thinking about how long she could keep pretending to be someone she wasn't before someone like Sterling decided that pretending was the same as lying, and lying was grounds for termination. The rain hammered against the window like applause, or like a warning. Katie couldn't decide which. She didn't know that her entire careful, constructed life was about to collapse in 3 days. She didn't know that Dr. Sterling was already building the case against her. She didn't know that Colonel Hartman would code at 2:17 a.m. on a night shift, that his heart would stop, that his oxygen saturation would plummet, and that she would save his life by breaking every protocol Dr. Sterling held sacred. She didn't know that doing the right thing would cost her everything. She just drank her coffee, watched the rain, kept her secrets, and waited for the storm that was already rolling toward her, already close enough that she should have felt the pressure change in the air. The afternoon shift at Oak Creek Memorial moved at its own rhythm, the steady percussion of beeping monitors, squeaking cart wheels, the soft whoosh of pneumatic doors. Katie pushed Colonel Hartman's vitals chart ahead of her as she entered room 304, where his daughter Sarah sat in the visitor's chair and her husband Mark stood near the window, his arms crossed with the posture of someone trying to appear helpful while contributing nothing. The Colonel's color was better than yesterday. His breathing steady. But Katie's eyes caught on something Dr. Sterling had written in the medication log, a beta blocker, dosage 75 milligrams, scheduled for 3 p.m. She'd reviewed his admission EKG this morning, a slightly elevated heart rate pattern that made a standard beta blocker dangerous without adjustment. It wasn't a small thing. It was the kind of detail that separated careful nursing from catastrophe. Katie had been trained to notice things like this. 12 years ago, in a trauma clinic in Baghdad, she'd caught a similar medication error that would have killed a Marine. The person who'd written that order had been a surgeon with 40 years of experience. And Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez had learned that experience and infallibility weren't the same creature. Dr. Sterling arrived at 2:52 p.m., his white coat unbuttoned, his Rolex catching the fluorescent light as he moved through the room with the easy confidence of a man who'd never been contradicted in his own domain. He examined the Colonel with practiced efficiency, nodding to himself, then reached for the medication chart. Katie waited until he was finishing his notes. She kept her voice quiet, professional, the exact tone of a junior nurse deferring to authority. "Doctor, could I speak with you about the beta blocker dosage?" His morning EKG showed an elevated rate pattern, and given his current heart rhythm, the full 75 milligrams might. Sterling's hand stopped moving. His pen hung suspended above the chart. The room pressure changed, not physically, but everyone felt it. He turned toward Katie slowly, his eyes moving across her face with the careful attention of someone reading an insult written in a foreign language. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. "Did you just question my clinical judgment?" Mark shifted his weight. Sarah's hands went still. "In front of a patient's family." Sterling continued, stepping closer to Katie. His presence had a density to it, the kind of manufactured authority that filled a room like smoke. Perhaps you're confused about the hierarchy of medical decision-making here, Nurse Rodriguez. I have a cardiology fellowship. 23 years in this unit. A published paper on beta-blocker protocols. He paused, letting each credential settle. And you have 3 months of probationary employment and some very enthusiastic clipboard work. Katie took one measured breath. Her jaw was tight, but her voice remained steady. I'm noting a potential contraindication, Doctor. No. Sterling stepped sideways, his body positioning himself between Katie and the Colonel, a physical assertion of territory. You're performing a task that was never assigned to you. You're second-guessing a physician's order. And you're doing it loud enough that families hear it and lose confidence in their care. He turned back to the chart with deliberate finality. Focus on what you're trained for. The Colonel doesn't need his nurse playing cardiologist. He needs her emptying bedpans and monitoring vital signs. Not, his glance at her was crystalline and cold, practicing medicine without a license. Sarah's eyes had widened. Mark looked at his shoes. Katie said nothing. She'd been trained for this too. The silence of a soldier who knows when to retreat tactically. She turned and left the room, her scrubs moving with the precise efficiency of someone whose muscle memory predated this hospital, this city, this civilian identity by more than a decade. The next morning, Sterling called her into room 304 at 7:15 a.m. Sarah was visiting again, standing near the window with coffee from the hospital cafeteria. The Colonel was drowsy from pain medication, but conscious enough to watch what was about to happen. Sterling held Katie's chart open, his reading glasses perched on his nose with the authority of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Nurse Rodriguez, he began, his tone addressing both Katie and Sarah simultaneously, this documentation shows a persistent failure to follow established protocols. Your tendency to overstep professional boundaries suggests either a fundamental incompetence or an insubordination problem. I'm documenting both possibilities here. He moved through the chart with methodical precision, circling notes, explaining each deficiency with clinical language designed to make simple mistakes sound like moral failures. 3 minutes of this. 5 minutes. 7 minutes of his voice in the quiet room, building a case against a woman who'd saved men's lives under fire, who'd held pressure on wounds while helicopters roared overhead, who'd made decisions that no one in this hospital had the training to comprehend. When he finished, he walked to the unit board in the hallway and pinned a formal write-up directly above the break room door. Katie's name circled in red marker. The words protocol violation and probationary status printed in bold. Timing was everything. By 8 a.m., every nurse on the afternoon shift would see it. Katie worked the morning efficiently, her hand steady, her documentation precise. At lunch, she sat in the break room with a sandwich and a bottle of water. 2 nurses, Julie and Christine, who'd chatted with her last week about their kids, glanced at her from the vending machine, exchanged something wordless, and left the room without their lunches. 3 more arrived, saw her sitting there, and performed the same choreography: grab something fast, exit faster, don't acknowledge the pariah. By 12:53 p.m., Katie was alone in the break room. She ate slowly, chewing each bite thoroughly, her presence so unremarkable that she could have been furniture. The fluorescent lights buzzed their electric hymn overhead. Rain began pattering against the window, a sound like 1,000 fingers tapping on glass. She didn't think about her husband. Didn't think about the seal tattoo on her left shoulder blade, covered now by standard scrubs. Didn't think about the combat boots in her locker downstairs, the only proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez had ever existed. Pain was information, and this pain was telling her something she already knew: she was expendable. Here, in this hospital, in this civilian life, she was nobody. Just another nurse with gaps in her resume and nobody to vouch for her. That afternoon, Sterling found her in the supply hallway while she was restocking trauma shears. He blocked her path with his body, standing close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive, the kind that cost more than her weekly car payment. His voice dropped to a register that was almost confidential, which somehow made it more threatening. You need to understand something, Rodriguez, he said. This unit runs on hierarchy. My hierarchy. Every medication order, every patient decision, every protocol comes through my authority. Do you understand? Do you acknowledge that? Katie looked up at him. His eyes were waiting for the moment when she'd crack, when she'd apologize, when she'd confirm that he was right and she was wrong and the natural order of things had been restored. One tear escaped from her right eye, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of holding everything down, holding it all in, keeping the composure that was both her armor and her prison. She wiped the tear away without breaking his gaze. Her voice came out with the precision of someone who'd been trained to speak under the worst conditions, in the darkest spaces, with lives depending on the exact calibration of her words. I've served under real leaders, Doctor, she said. You wouldn't recognize one in a mirror. She stepped around him, her shoulder not quite touching his arm, and continued down the hallway toward the patient rooms. Behind her, she could feel him standing there, suspended in the moment where his authority had failed to land, where his hierarchy had encountered something older and stronger than itself. She didn't look back. The evening shift stretched ahead of her. Vitals to check. Medications to document. A colonel with a heart condition and a daughter who'd witnessed her humiliation, probably wondering if this nurse was competent or just insubordinate. Katie moved through the hospital corridors with the steady rhythm of someone who'd learned long ago that survival required compartmentalization. She locked the sting away in a room and turned her attention to the one thing she could still control, her patients. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment that would change everything. That was still waiting in the dark, still rolling toward her on rubber wheels, still breathing shallow and fast, still minutes away from collapsing in a way that would force her to choose between obedience and conscience. Between the identity she was trying so hard to maintain and the instincts that had been burned into her bones by more than a decade of consequence. She picked up extra night shifts after that. Volunteered for the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. rotation where the day nurses wouldn't see her, where she could move through the hospital like a ghost, checking on patients while the rest of Oak Creek Memorial slept. The day staff's silence became easier to manage when she wasn't present to witness it. On her third consecutive overnight, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with a cup of coffee that tasted like exhaustion, Katie stopped by room 304 to check on the colonel. His oxygen saturation monitor showed 94%. His breathing was quiet. His color was steady. Everything normal. Everything fine. Everything exactly the way it was supposed to be until it suddenly wasn't. At 2:38 a.m., the monitor alarm began its electronic shriek. The monitor alarm began its electronic shriek at 2:27 a.m. Katie didn't look up from the medication cart she was restocking in the break room. Third consecutive overnight shift. She'd volunteered for them without hesitation. The night shift meant no Dr. Sterling, no staff meetings, no cold shoulders disguised as professionalism. Just the steady rhythm of cardiac monitors and the occasional page. The day nurses had made their position clear without words. Lunch trays left on counters. Equipment moved from where she'd positioned it. Conversation stopping the moment she entered a room. So she'd simply stopped entering rooms during daylight. Now she lived in the fluorescent-lit quiet of Oak Creek Memorial's graveyard hours, where the only judgment came from vital signs and blood work. The code blue alarm didn't sound. The pulse ox alarm did, the high-pitched electronic wail that meant oxygen saturation was dropping faster than the monitor could display it. Katie's hand stilled on the medication vials. That alarm pattern. She knew that pattern. Colonel James Hartman's room was on the cardiac unit, 3rd floor, bed 7. She was moving before her conscious mind finished the thought, trauma shears already hanging from her scrub's pocket clicking against her thigh as she cut through the corridor. The fluorescent lights blurred overhead. Her breath came steady, controlled, the kind of breathing that came from years of training her body not to lie. The kind of breathing you learned in Baghdad when panic could kill faster than bullets. The monitors were screaming when she reached his door. Hartman's oxygen saturation read 62. Then 58. His skin had taken on the grey-blue cast of a man whose blood wasn't carrying oxygen anymore. His trachea, the windpipe that should run straight down the center of his neck, was deviating sharply to the left. The breathing tube placed 3 days ago during his initial cardiac admission was still patent, still delivering oxygen, but something had collapsed inside his chest cavity. Air trapped in the pleural space. Tension building. The lung pressing down on his heart like a fist slowly closing. Katie saw it all in the space of 2 heartbeats. Tension pneumothorax, she said aloud. Not a question. Not a request for confirmation. A statement of fact delivered in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone with authority, someone who'd made this diagnosis before under worse conditions, under fire, under the weight of knowing that the next 60 seconds determined whether a man went home or went into a body bag. A resident named Chen was standing at the bedside, frozen. The night nurse, Rodriguez, the chart said, but it wasn't her, was reaching for the phone to page Sterling. Katie didn't wait. She was already opening the crash cart, already locating the 14-gauge angiocath needle with the precision of muscle memory, already running through the procedure with the kind of calm that comes from having done it when people were actively trying to kill you. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, she said to Chen, though Chen wasn't moving. Katie's hands were already moving. They didn't shake. They didn't hesitate. The alcohol swab came out, the skin cleaned in a practiced arc, and then the needle was advancing through skin and fascia and pleural membrane. The angle had to be exact. Too shallow and you missed. Too deep and you punctured the lung itself. The hiss came like a sigh of relief. Air escaped through the catheter in a sound that filled the entire room, a thin, pressurized whistle that meant the collapsed space was decompressing, the tension releasing, the lung expanding back into the cavity it had been forced out of. Katie secured the catheter with her free hand while her eyes stayed locked on the monitor. Oxygen saturation climbed. 65, 71. 78, 84. 89. Get me a chest tube, Katie said to the frozen resident. Not a request. Not a question. And page Dr. Sterling. Tell him we have a tension pneumothorax, decompressed, awaiting physician. Hartman's color was returning. The gray-blue had faded back to the pale pink of someone whose blood was finally carrying oxygen again. His wife Sarah, who'd been sitting in the corner chair all night, as she had every night since his admission, was sobbing now, but the sobs had changed. The first ones had been terror. These were relief. Katie's hands remained steady on the catheter. Her voice remained level. Patient stabilized. Vitals normalizing. O2 sat maintaining at 88%. She glanced at Chen. You're going to assist with the chest tube placement. 2-tube technique, wait for Sterling's orders on suction settings. That wasn't Chen's call to make. That wasn't Katie's call to make either. But she made it anyway, because sometimes protocols were written by people who'd never had to choose between waiting for authorization and watching someone die. Sterling arrived 9 minutes later. Katie knew it was 9 minutes because she'd been counting. She always counted. The monitor clock read 0256 hours, and when the door opened it became 0305. His face moved through 3 distinct expressions in the space of seeing her standing beside Hartman's bed. First, confusion. Then, white-faced realization. Then, a cold smile that looked like something carved from stone. What did you do? His voice was soft. That was worse than if he'd shouted. Soft meant calculated. Soft meant he was already planning something. Katie held out the chart. Emergency needle decompression, 0253 hours. Tension pneumothorax. Patient presented with classic signs, tracheal deviation, plummeting O2 saturation, hypoxemia. Decompression successful. Catheter positioned at second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Vital stable pending chest tube placement. Sterling took the chart, but he wasn't really reading it. His eyes were moving over the information without absorbing it, the way a person's eyes moved when they were already looking at something else. Something dangerous. You performed an invasive procedure without authorization, he said. His voice had dropped further, down to something barely above a whisper. Do you understand what you've done? Katie met his eyes. The colonel's wife was still crying. The monitor was beeping its steady rhythm. Somewhere down the hallway, someone was calling for more ice chips. The whole hospital continued on around this moment that felt like it was happening in a separate, oxygen-starved room. "I saved his life," Katie said. Sterling's smile widened. It was the smile of someone who'd just been given exactly what he needed. "You ended your career." He left the room at 0318 hours. Katie knew because she watched the second hand on the monitor clock tick past his departure. By 0322, he was calling the hospital board president at home. By 0335, he was calling Katie's nursing school references. By 0347, he had a patient safety investigator on the phone, someone he knew personally, someone who owed him a favor or had already agreed to be owed one. By 0401, he was speaking to legal counsel about the foundation for a termination case. Katie remained at Hartman's bedside through all of it, monitoring the chest tube placement when Sterling returned to perform it, checking vitals every 15 minutes, documenting everything with the kind of precision that would have made her senior officers proud. The procedure was textbook. The colonel's oxygenation remained stable. By morning, he was breathing well enough to ask Katie if she was his nurse, and when he asked, something flickered in his eyes, a moment of recognition that his conscious mind couldn't quite place, like trying to remember a dream after waking. She didn't answer the question. She just checked his bandages and left the room. The next 48 hours moved like a cascade. Sterling filed formal termination paperwork citing patient safety violations and insubordination. He brought the investigator to interview Katie at 2 p.m. on the second day, asking questions in that soft, careful way that made each one sound like it had teeth. "Tell us about the gaps in your employment history, Ms. Rodriguez." Between nursing school and Oak Creek, there's a 5-year period with no documentation. Katie delivered the cover story she'd been trained to deliver, the one she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in the shower and while staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning. Private home health care. The family's preferred confidentiality. The investigator exchanged a look with Sterling. That look was the end of everything. On the 72nd hour after the needle decompression, security escorted Katie from the hospital. Her access badge was deactivated before she even reached her car. Sterling watched from his office window on the 3rd floor. Katie could feel his eyes tracking her across the parking lot like a sniper tracking a target, except she was already out of range, already removed, already erased from the hospital she'd been building a life in for 3 months. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part came that night. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway of the cardiac unit at 2:53 a.m., watching the monitors climb. Oxygen saturation climbing. Heart rate stabilizing. The colonel's trachea had shifted back into place, and the hiss of released pressure still hung in the air like a ghost. Katie Rodriguez stood beside the bed with her hand steady, checking the fall line, her movements precise as a Swiss watch. Sterling's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. She had done it without him. Without permission. Without waiting. She had performed an emergency needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, a procedure that required a physician's order, and she had acted like the decision belonged to her. Sterling turned and walked back to his office. He didn't run. He didn't yell. He closed his door, sat at his desk in the dark, and reached for his phone. His network was substantial. 23 years of careful relationship building, board dinners, country club memberships, and favors owed. One phone call would start a chain reaction. One phone call would remind everyone that he was the one who built this unit's reputation. He dialed the hospital board president at 3:15 a.m. The man answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. Sterling didn't apologize for the hour. "We have a critical patient safety issue. A probationary nurse performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization at 2:22 a.m. Her employment history has significant gaps. I suspect she's been hiding something. I want a formal investigation and a termination meeting within 72 hours. Sterling's voice was calm, authoritative, the voice of a man stating facts. I'm bringing in an outside patient safety investigator. This needs to be airtight. The board president made a sound like a man fully awake now. Who is the nurse? Katie Rodriguez. New to the unit. 3 months in. By 4:48 a.m., Sterling had called 3 members of Katie's nursing school cohort, people he'd cultivated relationships with over years of hospital conferences and networking events. He didn't ask directly. He asked carefully. I'm working on a reference check. Katie Rodriguez. Can you tell me about any concerning behaviors during your studies together? Anything that suggests deception or unstable decision-making? The pause after each question was long enough for him to hear the shift in their tone, the moment they wondered what Katie had done, the moment they began to doubt her. By 6 a.m., Sterling had contacted an outside patient safety investigator named Harrison Price, a man who owed Sterling a favor from a previous case where Sterling had provided testimony that protected Price's firm from liability. I need a thorough review. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Employment history gaps suggesting possible fraud. I want documentation that builds a clear termination case. Price's response was immediate, 48 hours. I'll have a preliminary report. Sterling sat back in his chair as the sun rose over Savannah. His chest felt tight but not with fear. With satisfaction. With the certainty of a man who understood how institutional power worked. Katie Rodriguez had made a calculation, save the colonel's life or follow protocol. She had chosen incorrectly. Now the system would correct her. The system worked for people like Sterling. By day 2, Price's investigator had interviewed 3 nurses who confirmed that Katie had acted without proper authorization and had displayed concerning confidence for someone at her experience level. One nurse mentioned the combat boots in Katie's locker, a detail Price highlighted in his report. Employment history contains unexplained gaps. Candidate's background check appears incomplete. Recommend full disciplinary review. The implication was clear. There was something wrong with her, something hidden, something that justified caution. On day 3, at exactly 4 p.m., Katie was summoned to the Human Resources office. She expected a commendation. She expected them to thank her for saving the colonel's life. Instead, she found a security guard waiting outside her locker. His name was Marcus, not the same Marcus, never the same Marcus, and he carried a termination packet in his left hand while his right rested on his belt. You've been terminated effective immediately, the HR director said, not meeting Katie's eyes. We'll need your access badge and hospital ID. Security will escort you through the clearing process. The words arrived like rounds fired from a distance, hitting hard but not immediately sharp. Katie nodded once. Can I have 10 minutes to clear my locker? You have that. The guard watched from 3 feet away as Katie opened her locker. The stethoscope her husband Marcus had given her 8 years ago. A photo of him in his SEAL dress uniform, taken 3 weeks before the Baghdad mission. And on the top shelf, the pair of worn combat boots, the leather creased in all the places they'd been creased in 2018, the laces still tied exactly as they'd been tied the day she'd placed them in this locker and ordered herself to become someone else. She wrapped the boots in a plastic bag with the care you'd use handling something sacred. The stethoscope went on top. The photo went on top of that. She placed everything in a cardboard box and held it against her chest like a child. Nurses watched from doorways as the guard escorted her down the hallway. Sarah Hartman appeared near the elevators, her eyes red and wet. You saved my father's life, she said, her voice breaking. You saved him. Katie nodded once and kept walking. The words were kind, but they changed nothing. She had broken protocol. She had acted outside her authority. She had failed to remain invisible, and that failure had consequences. The parking lot was hot and still. The trash bag with the combat boots sat on the passenger seat as Katie drove, still in her scrubs because there hadn't been time to change, still in the wet fabric that had absorbed the sweat of crisis. She drove south toward Savannah Memorial Gardens, her hand steady on the wheel, her mind moving through the procedures of collapse. The rain started as she parked. Not a storm, something quieter, something that seemed to fall from the sky with purpose. Katie walked to Marcus's grave in scrubs and bare feet where her shoes had come off somewhere in the car. The grass was wet and cold. She knelt in the mud. I tried to stay invisible like they ordered. Her voice came out steady, the voice of someone reporting a mission status. I tried to follow their rules. Disappear into normal life. Be someone that nobody would question. She looked at the headstone, Marcus James Rodriguez, 1989 to 2018. Navy SEAL. Beloved husband. Father. But I couldn't watch him die, Marcus. Colonel Hartman. I couldn't stand there and do nothing while her voice cracked exactly once, a single fracture in the composure she'd maintained for 6 years. I failed you again. I failed the mission. I couldn't even manage to stay hidden. She stayed at the grave until the rain turned dark and cold. A woman in wet scrubs, kneeling in the mud, saying goodbye to a life she'd been ordered to erase. When Katie drove home, the trash bag with the combat boots sat in her trunk. She'd read the termination paperwork in her car. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Employment history gaps suggesting deception. Pattern of insubordination. The language was careful, institutional, the language of people protecting themselves. Sterling's name appeared in the investigator's report twice. Both times, it was positioned as a concerned colleague reporting safety violations. The apartment was dark and cold when she arrived. Half-packed boxes lined the walls, the boxes she'd been packing in preparation for a normal transition, a planned movement to something that resembled peace. The boxes felt different now. They felt like surrender. Katie sat in the dark for 2 hours, staring at nothing, until her phone buzzed. A text from Miguel, "Stay up. I'm coming home." But that wasn't the only thing coming home. Miguel arrived at 11:11 p.m. carrying something that made Katie's breath stop, a shoe box, worn cardboard, the kind you didn't see anymore. He didn't explain. He simply held it out, his 16-year-old hands trembling slightly, and said, "Don't burn anything yet, Mom." Inside the box was a Navy cross. Katie was packing the last box when Miguel walked through the apartment door, his 16-year-old frame filling the doorway like someone twice his age. He carried something in both hands, a shoe box, weathered and tape-sealed, the kind of box that held secrets. His voice cracked before he even spoke. "Mom, they need to see these. You can't let him win." Inside were medals. A Navy cross wrapped in tissue paper like something sacred. 2 silver stars nested beside it. And below them, photocopies of her service record, the pages crisp and official, stamped with congressional seals that no hospital board had ever seen. Katie's hands went still on the cardboard box she'd been taping. She didn't reach for them. Not yet. She looked at her son instead, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't seen in 3 days. Hope. The kind of hope that belongs to someone who still believes the system works, who still believes truth matters. She had spent 2 decades protecting that belief for people like him. She had spent the last 72 hours teaching him that belief was naive. Now he was teaching her differently. "Miguel, sweetheart. Don't." He set the box down on the kitchen counter with the care of someone placing a bomb. "I found these in the attic 3 years ago. I didn't understand what they meant. I do now." He pulled out his phone, showing her a screen filled with congressional database results. He'd printed everything. Service record, official citations, the whole thing. The internet remembers you, Mom. Even if the Navy tried to forget you. The next morning, Miguel walked into Oak Creek Memorial's administrative conference room on the 3rd floor. Katie waited in the hallway, her hand against the cold wall, not trembling. That word didn't apply to her anymore, just present. She could hear him through the door, his young voice steady. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez." The room went dead silent. That particular kind of silence that happens when the architecture of everything people believe shifts under their feet. Katie could hear it from the hallway, the absence of sound that means someone just spoke words that rewrote the air pressure in the room. The administrator's voice came next, confused. "I'm sorry, who?" "Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez." Miguel again, not asking, stating it like a witness in court. "My mother." "Your nurse. The one you fired 3 days ago." Through the conference room's glass wall, Katie could see them, the hospital board members, the chief nursing officer, Sterling's empty chair where he'd been summoned and had arrived confident, untouchable. The chief nursing officer stood, her hands trembling as she opened the file Miguel had brought. Katie watched her eyes move across the first page, watched the woman's mouth open slightly. Then she began reading aloud, her voice carrying the weight of words she should have seen 3 days ago. Multiple combat deployments. Field trauma specialist. Citation for Valor, Baghdad 2009. Citation for Valor, Baghdad 2010. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty. Each word landed like a hammer. The conference room door opened. A man in Navy dress blues walked in, Commander Thomas Holloway, SEAL Team 3, the same Commander Sterling had called during his reference campaign, fishing for information he could use. Holloway's face was the color of storm clouds. "Dr. Sterling called me 4 days ago," Holloway said, his voice like gravel in a diesel engine. "He was trying to verify employment gaps. He didn't know who he was asking about." The commander looked directly at the board members, his presence making the air feel pressurized, the way a room feels before lightning strikes. Senior Chief Rodriguez carried 7 wounded through enemy fire in Baghdad, including then Captain James Hartman, before a political scandal buried the whole operation. She was ordered to disappear. "You just fired her for saving that same man's life." He paused. The silence stretched. "That's treason. That's career-ending. That's federal." An FBI agent arrived within 60 minutes. Special Agent Lisa Chen, with a laptop and a folder that made Sterling's face go the color of bleached bone. She laid out the evidence with precision, Sterling's fabricated records, falsified patient safety reports, witness statements that had been forged in his own handwriting. The pattern went back 11 years. For previous nurses, all women who had questioned his judgment, all terminated on manufactured grounds, all of whom had sued him into settlement. All of whom had stayed silent because he'd made silence profitable. "We've been tracking Dr. Sterling for 18 months, Agent Chen said, her voice steady and clinical. "Your hospital is the pattern's conclusion, not its beginning." The evidence he attempted to forge on Senior Chief Rodriguez was sloppy. "It's what got him caught." She pulled out the arrest warrant, and the administrator's hand shook as she read it. Sterling was led out of Oak Creek Memorial at 3:41 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, his wrists in handcuffs that caught the fluorescent light like accusations. The nurses who had abandoned Katie in the break room, who had carried their trays away when she sat down, who had whispered behind their hands, they watched from the corridor as federal agents escorted him past. One of them met Katie's eyes. Just one. The others looked away. 6 months later, Katie stood in her new office on the 4th floor of Oak Creek Memorial, where they'd created the trauma coordinator position specifically for her. Her hands moved across case files, cross-referencing protocols, training the next generation of nurses in the precision that comes from having lived through real fire. The combat boots, the one Sterling had seen in her locker that first day and mentally flagged as suspicious, now lived in a shadow box on her office shelf. Glass-fronted. Preserved. Beside them sat a photograph from Colonel Hartman's promotion ceremony to Brigadier General, his arm around his daughter Sarah, his uniform pristine, his eyes holding the look of someone who'd remembered something that had been stolen from him. Katie had been there for the ceremony. Sitting in the 3rd row of the auditorium in Savannah, watching her name become visible in ways it never could have been while she was invisible. Brigadier General Hartman had rolled up his sleeve during the speech, the formal military ceremony, the whole thing, and shown the tattoo on his forearm. Her name? Rodriguez, he'd said into the microphone, his voice carrying through the auditorium like a radio signal finding the frequency it was built for. "I got this in Baghdad because someone named Rodriguez saved my life. I spent 6 years trying to find her, trying to remember her face. She was here the whole time, and we fired her for saving me twice." He'd paused, let the words settle. "I learned in combat that you don't wait for permission to do the right thing. That's what Senior Chief Rodriguez taught me. I'm finally thanking her publicly." The sound of the photograph's framed glass beneath Katie's fingertips now, touching it absently the way some people touch prayer beads. She could see Sterling through her office window sometimes, had caught him walking past the hospital once, looking thinner, diminished, the way certain men get when they lose the infrastructure that held them up. But mostly she didn't see him anymore. She didn't need to. The folding table outside the strip mall sat between a vape shop and a nail salon on the south side of Savannah. Weathered aluminum legs, a banner that read "Affordable Coverage, Ask Me How," in letters that were already fading. Dr. Marcus Sterling sat behind it in a suit that had cost $40 and looked it, processing supplemental insurance applications for people who needed coverage but couldn't afford better. 2 applications per day if he was lucky. Most people walked past without looking. Katie's car stopped at the traffic light directly in front of his table on a Thursday afternoon. She could see him through the windshield, see him recognize her in the moment before his eyes slid away. 3 seconds of connection. Then nothing. She continued to Oak Creek Memorial, where the quarterly board meeting was being held, where she presented the Veteran Hiring Initiative success rates, 15 combat medics placed in nursing roles across Savannah's hospital system, retention rate 97%, 0 disciplinary incidents, highest patient satisfaction scores in trauma services. Brigadier General Hartman attended as guest speaker, his uniform pressed to razor sharpness. "Senior Chief Rodriguez proved what I learned in Baghdad," he told the board, his voice carrying the weight of command and gratitude layered together. "Heroes don't need recognition to do the right thing. But they deserve it anyway." He looked directly at Katie when he said it. That night, a young nurse with a Marine Corps tattoo visible under her scrub sleeve asked Katie about the combat boots in the shadow box as they prepared for shift briefing. Katie touched the glass, her fingers steady. "Those boots walked through fire to carry people home. They remind me why we do this work." The nurse nodded, understanding something deeper than the surface words. Miguel's text came through as Katie was starting rounds, a photo from the Naval Academy's obstacle course, his mud-covered grinning face, the caption reading, "Rodriguez doesn't quit." Katie smiled and began the briefing, her voice calm and steady, training the next generation to save lives with precision and honor. "In emergency medicine," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned that lesson in Blood and Fire, "you don't wait for permission to do the right thing. You act, you accept the consequences, and you never leave anyone behind." Thanks for watching. If Katie's story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your strength, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Your stories matter. And they might be next.